Hello, listener. So, I'm going to go off on a bit of a rant about a topic that I find somewhat underexplored, which is the role of the Southern Europeans in the development of the modern world, of European knowledge, of what we are living in today. And that is by talking a little bit about their period of preeminence, the discoveries from the perspective of a number of fairly heroic individuals. And I'm putting this in the context of the Faustian Spirit because while the Faustian Spirit is usually associated with an unquenchable thirst for knowledge, after all, it's called after a person who sold his soul to the devil so he could become immortal, and he would become immortal so he could explore all knowledge. But there's also an association in there with adventure, because after all, to find knowledge sometimes is to explore things and to explore places, physical places, to explore the unknown, physical or mental. So Faustian can also be used in the context of adventure frequently, and sometimes it is used in that sense. So while we in the north tend to go for knowledge, and we come to a new place, we go exploring the plants and the geology, the Iberians had a lot more hands-on approach to this sort of thing, especially in the field of anthropology, where they had an approach which was sort of drag your sword and dagger, stab the heathens in the neck, take their gold, rape their women, convert the survivors for the glory of the Mother Church of Catholicism. That was sort of their approach. And there's a few figures in this who are interesting because they are not well known, especially in the current nationalist discourse or public discourse. People know about Pizarro and people know about Cortes, even though what they know about, for example, Cortez is sort of a very minimalistic view of him. But they often don't know about someone who I find very interesting, who is called Fernando Spinto, who was a Portuguese explorer, mercenary, merchant, colonial administrator, a number of things. And he wrote a autobiography called Peregrinação, Pilgrimage. And for people who don't know, I spent about 12 years of my life in Portugal. I went to school there. I even attended 1 year of university at the University of Coimbra, studying law. And I found Portuguese literature interesting for a time, and I read a lot about it. A lot of their literature really starts in this sort of discoveries period. The big epos of Portuguese literature is Lusíadas by Vasco da Gama, which is a predecessor to Fernando Spinto, and the main distinguishing thing between them is though both are sort of autobiographical, taking the author as the main character, Vasco da Gama is writing a heroic epos of the Portuguese people and their glorious achievements. And he models this very strongly on the classics, on the Iliad, on the Aeneid, on the Odyssey, and it becomes very mystical. During his tale of how the Portuguese rounded the Cape of Good Hope and found India, conquered Goa, and brought back spices, and founded the Portuguese Empire, there's nymphs and there's giants and krakens, and the gods intervene on the side of the Portuguese. And the classical gods, Venus, Aphrodite appears even. So that's a mystified story. Whereas Fernando Spinto does not exaggerate any of the circumstances he is in. He paints a fairly accurate portrayal of the places he goes to, the people he visits, their customs and their religions, but he exaggerates his own achievements. So Fernando Spinto, like Vasco da Gama, embarks in Portugal, travels to India, and he serves as a soldier and an administrator in India, fighting in the first instance against the Turks in the Gulf, in the Red Sea, in the Gulf of Arabia, as Vasco da Gama did. But from there, his exploits go all over the place. Fernando Spinto becomes a mercenary for the Mughals. He fights for the Turks, against the Turks. He goes to Java, where he is enslaved, escapes, goes back to India. Then he goes to China, where he intends to rob the tomb of the emperors, which is supposedly on an island. He completely made this place up. It doesn't exist. Then supposedly he is captured, and he is put as a slave to work on the Great Wall of China. Now, two things. Slavery in China historically wasn't really a thing. Indentured labor, of course, was, but that was to pay off debts. And the Great Wall of China had been finished for a few centuries at this point, because Fernando Spinto's travels are from about the 1550s, 1560s. And by that point, the Great Wall of China had long been finished. So that's completely untrue. And then he says he escapes slavery from the Chinese and he joins the Mongols, and he helps the Mongols conquer a Chinese city, and he is congratulated by the great Khan himself. Of course, probably none of that is true. What is probably true is that he did travel to China as a merchant or a soldier or an explorer in the service of the Portuguese crown in some capacity, and he did note down a lot of their customs and how their cities look and so on. That's accurate, because those parts of what he tells are true. And then the same goes, he travels to Japan, and we know he went to Japan because he was a member of the Order of Jesus, the Jesuits, and he was engaged in the conversion of the Japanese. Now here again he exaggerates his own exploits. He claims he introduced the arquebus to the Japanese, sort of gunpowder. He claims that he almost managed to convert one of the big major daimyos in Japan, who did in fact later convert, but this was long after Pinto had left East Asia. So he exaggerates a lot of his claims, but he is one of the few European sources we have of this time period about Asia. And a lot of his exploits are maybe exaggerated, but the detailed accounts are true. In that sense, it's Faustian because it's scientific. It's an anthropological work in a sense. But at the same time, he was also a soldier. He did fight the Turks. He was always on an adventure, and that's sort of what makes these people interesting. Because in the case of Cortes, and this makes it similar to Pinto, is that they were at the edges of the empire, acting on their own initiative. Pinto half the time wasn't acting on the orders of anyone. He was doing things for his own glory and interest, for money. And he became quite wealthy, and he, at the end of his life, donated a lot of his money to the Jesuits, mainly for the cause of converting Japan. The thing with Cortes is often depicted as if he sailed from Spain to Mexico, burned his ships, conquered Mexico, and he had to do or die. It's a bit exaggerated. You have to remember, Cortes set off to Mexico in 1519. By that point, the Spanish had been in the Americas for 27 years. Hispaniola had been colonized by Columbus and his sons, and they had already established a base there. Cortes himself was engaged in the conquest of Cuba, and he was an administrator in Cuba for 5 years. So it wasn't that he had to wait for reinforcements or supplies all the way from Spain. No, from the Caribbean islands. There was already an established military and civil presence and religious presence of Spain in predominantly Hispaniola and Cuba. And he was actually countermanded to return. He refused to return, burned his ships. Then the local governor sent troops after him to capture him, and those actually ended up joining him. And then, everyone knows how the story goes from there. He recruits a whole lot of native allies. He finds a woman who speaks Spanish, and he uses the translator. He, of course, has relations with this woman, and he has a mestizo son. He has, in fact, many mestizo sons, and he conquers, the Aztec Empire, slaughters the Aztec aristocracy during one of their festivals unprovoked. And it's one of those things that people also tend to, especially like in the public perception, is that these conquistadors could do just whatever they wanted. That's not in fact true. Columbus himself served jail time for what he did to the natives. And Cortes was investigated by the Inquisition for what he did to the natives, because even though while at the edge of empire and they're the conquerors and they can do sort of whatever they want, eventually civil authority and religious authority comes after them to establish law and order. And this is what happened with Cortes. He ruled New Mexico for about 4 years, and pretty much as soon as he had conquered the place, the religious orders followed him and they started investigating them. And for example, one of the things that would happen is that lieutenants would rebel and conquistadors would fight each other. One of the conquistadors who served under Cortes, for example, deserted with a whole bunch of men, went to conquer Honduras, proclaimed his independence from Spain. Cortes had to kill him, and this was investigated as a murder by the Inquisition, which was the sort of both the secular and the religious authority. And there was a fight between the settlers, the crown, the local military, and the church about the natives. And and this is just a little interesting detail because I'm Dutch, one of the biggest opponents of Cortes was Pope Adriaan VI, who is the only Dutch pope to have ever existed. And he opposed crimes against the natives by colonizers like Cortes. And another famous priest who argued against the slavery and mistreatment and killing of natives was Antonio Vieira, a Portuguese priest himself. He was an octoroon as well. He was pretty humanistic. You could compare him to someone like Spinoza, I guess, in his what he talked about, a humanist. He never succeeded really in arguing for equal rights for the Indians or abolishing slavery, but the church did try to establish its authority over these people. So it wasn't that they could just do anything. There was law and there was order coming after them to make sure that these people were treated somewhat rightly, the Indians, that is. Now, you know, probably Pizarro was a second cousin of Cortes, and that's another interesting little thing about Cortes and Pizarro and a number of the other conquistadors, is that they were usually from southern Spain, and they were descended from the families who had, the lower nobility, who had led the Reconquista, or were the main fighters in the Reconquista. So the people who fought against the Moors to push them out and reconquer the lost Christian lands, although they didn't reconquer everything, of course, because Northern Africa, which had been a Christian Roman province, but is still Muslim to this day, but they did reconquer Iberia. And it was this line of nobles from which Pizarro and Cortes descended that reconquered Iberia, and then also went to conquer New Spain, the New World. So it's another interesting little thing about genetics playing such a role, because you probably had a big selection over the course of 700 years of fighting for very aggressive people in that line. And Cortes and Pizarro were both known for being very, very malcontent and aggressive in their youth and even in their relations with the crown. Cortes ended up being relieved of his position of governor of New Mexico, and would never hold important positions because he couldn't keep from fighting with other governors, even with the king himself. And I think that's sort of where this Faustian thing is interesting, because the Southern European stereotypes that they're more passionate and more, bloody, I guess. They're more willing to fight, and they're, romance, passionate, more passionate and so on. And you see that very much in these conquerors, where how did the Anglo-Saxons and the Dutch really do their colonialism? It was really bureaucratic and administrative. We come with considerably more troops, we come considerably more colonizers, and we just take over the whole place, systematic, and institute a whole economic system right away. The Spanish and Portuguese conquests were much more gradual, much more staggered, much more spur of the moment things, and of course they mixed a lot more with the locals. The funniest thing about Cortes is that the best known monument, or the biggest monument that still exists to him, is in Mexico City today, and it is called Monument de Métissage, because he had a lifelong affair with a native woman, probably several, and he had one son he had recognized by the church, Don Martins, who was half Indian, and he is also known as the first mestizo. And there was a monument built to him. And funnily enough, actually, it doesn't have many supporters. Like the Mexican nationalists who are in favor of the Castilian heritage of Mexico don't like it, because even though it glorifies Cortes, it glorifies the relations with the Indians. Whereas the Indian nativist nationalists don't like it because they just don't like Cortes or the Spanish aspect of it, and they just want it all gone. They in fact proposed burning the bones of Cortes in front of a statue of one of his opponents during the conquest of Mexico. I forget the name, Koshu something or other, but in a really sort of Aztec ritualistic sacrifice. But that's really so. If we're all Europeans, South and North, and we have all the Faustian spirit in us, it really is expressed in different ways. Where the more passionate, romantic, exploratory is in the South, and the rational and so on is in the North. Now that doesn't mean there isn't crossover. Wagner is very romantic. There's aspects of romantic nationalism in the north, and there's also science in the south, of course. But these stereotypes, they do exist for a reason, because that is the nature of our people. In the past we used to make arguments like climate relations to the blood, the sort of humorous theory. And if you go by just the cold winter theory of time preference, that will also work. For example, that Europeans in the north are simply more low time preference, therefore able to delay gratification and able to be more calculative, whereas in the south there's less need for this, so they're perceived as more passionate by us, because it's a matter of perception as well. Like, we might perceive a southern European as more passionate, but we would perceive an African as far more passionate, So there's these sorts of differences, and I'm just kind of sad that a lot of this is so overlooked, because the discoveries is a period really where Europe starts outpacing the rest of the world, starts becoming, it overcomes Rome, sort of. It overcomes the civilizational and technological level of Rome, and it starts really conquering the world and dominating the world and developing the modern world in terms of science, but also in terms of conquest. And the Portuguese and Spanish played a huge role in this, in finding these places, mapping them, for introducing the Columbian exchange, where we brought all these crops back to Europe we really needed for our survival, like potatoes. Like, half your diet today is actually from plants that come from the Americas. Pumpkins, tomatoes, corn, potatoes, even squashes, and types of spinaches. Spinach is native to Europe, but there are types that are from the Americas. So that was quite important in developing the nutritional needs, for example, to support a bigger population, allowing a more colonization of the Americas, for example. And comparatively, that's why it's the heroic part. They did it with minimal amounts of troops. Like, Cortez had about 500 European soldiers. Sure, he had also a lot of native allies. But Pizarro did it with just 170 men, conquering the entire Inca Empire. And Fernando Spinto, when he was in his discoveries and raiding against the Turks and so on, he had a handful of men, sometimes just a dozen or 20 to 30 European soldiers. And he got a lot of stuff done. Of course, we don't know exactly how much he actually got done, because he exaggerates so much in his own autobiography. But they did do a lot. The conquistadors were always just tiny numbers against huge hosts. And even in the later colonial period, when, for example, the British went to conquer the Zulus, there were still considerably more British troops needed for this to conquer the Zulus, where there were at Islandwana, for example, there were 1,400 British troops, and they were defeated by the Zulus. And the Zulus were of a comparable technological level to the Aztecs, really. Pretty much the same. The Aztecs may have been even more advanced, in fact. And it was really these tiny, tiny numbers of Europeans doing all this conquering. So that makes it, very heroic, very Faustian. And that is an aspect in that spirit. And another thing is that in Portugal, because I'm going to talk about Portugal from this, because that's what I'm most familiar with, they've really been infected with this American virus of self-hatred. Where now, like 10 years ago, when I was studying in Portugal, this was not a thing. Portugal still had a very paternalistic attitude towards its former colonies, where it took in Brazilian and Angolan students and gave them a Portuguese education so they could go to their home countries and improve them. Because even though Portugal is a poor country by European standards compared to most of the rest of the world, it's not it's well to do, and even compared to its former colonies, it's fairly well off. And its educational standards are, of course, considerably better, even than Brazil. In Brazil, it's a mark of prestige to have had a Portuguese education. Especially, for example, when I studied law in Coimbra, there were a lot of Brazilians, because Coimbra is the most renowned law university and linguistics university in the Portuguese-speaking world. So you'd get a degree from there. You would really be... That was a mark of prestige in Brazil. So they still have this attitude, but nowadays they have been infected with this stuff, and they're talking about taking down statues of the navigators and the discoverers, and saying that they have, to pay reparations for enslaving the Africans and the conquering the Indians and committing genocide against the Indians and so on. So that's really been infecting them lately, and there's even a political party now in their parliament, led of course by a black woman. I forget what their name is, but they are advocating for this kind of thing, for reparations, for apologies. And this sort of self-glorification you see in Da Gama and Pinto, where they make no apologies and they're just in the service of God and the crown, and especially in service of Catholicism. That's gone. And when I studied Portuguese literature, because I studied it in school, that's been gone for a while. Like the big works of glorious epos and so on, those existed in the time of the discoveries, and you can find some medieval poetry about the Reconquista, but there hasn't been for about 2 centuries anything really that glorious. There's some poems, for example, and theater plays about the Napoleonic Wars. The Portuguese did play a role there, but those are actually the most known play of the period is against the British, who were their allies during the war against the French. However, as the Anglos want to do, they installed a dictatorship over Portugal after the Napoleonic Wars, and they stayed there for 7 years until 1821, and there had to be a popular uprising to kick out the British and bring the king back, because otherwise it would have very well been possible that Portugal would have been just taken as a colony by the British, essentially. Typical Anglo tricks. Well, I guess that's sort of the rant there. Just underexplored characters, underexplored mythology. Sad that there isn't more sense of self-heroism in Iberia. I mean, it has a lot to do with, of course, the fact that Salazar and Franco were there for so long. I remember that the most Portuguese people aren't very political, but those who were often very leftist, because there is a communist party in Portugal, and it is somewhat big in a modern Western country, and it's just a legacy of Salazar, really. And I imagine it's somewhat similar in Spain, and that's also where the entryway for the self-hatred comes in, really. That opens the gateway for all this American rhetoric, although I'm sure that even without that the American rhetoric would get in, because the Americans poison everything everywhere with their ridiculous discourse.